Well, good evening. I'm Walter Sterling, the Dean of St. John's College, Santa Fe, as most of you know. I welcome all of you this evening to our annual Steiner Lecture, a part of the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series, which is open to the Santa Fe community as well as to our campus community. This year, we are especially pleased to offer the Steiner Lecture as part of our Conference on Liberal Education, which is itself part of our year-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Santa Fe campus of St. John's. The Steiner Lecture honors the memory of Andrew Steiner, an alumnus of the college, class of 1963. The Andrew Steiner Visiting Scholar Fund has the purpose of bringing to our campuses people of distinction with fresh perspectives on the work done at the college. Our former dean, Eva Brand, who offered a talk for us this afternoon, introduced the first Steiner Lecture in 1992 on our Annapolis campus. I was grateful to be present for that first lecture and for Ms. Brand's eloquent introduction. I knew Andrew, who was a classmate and friend of my father, and I spent many hours at his home as a child. He loved St. John's College, where his time as a student had opened up for him the expansive horizons of an intelligent, reflective, artful, and humane life. I recall him fondly as a man of gentle wit, good humor, curiosity, generosity, and warm affection for family and friends. He was a loving family man and a successful businessman, but one who clung to the sense that the best of life involved the grace of intellect, art, imagination, and conversation, all to be shared with others. There can be no better tribute to the high purposes of a liberal education than such a life. And our college continues to be grateful to his friends and family for endowing the Steiner Lecture in his honor. My colleague and a tutor at the college, Michael Golliber, will now introduce our lecturer.
It is with great pleasure and with even greater appreciation that I introduce our Steiner lecturer, Dr. Roger Scruton. Dr. Scruton comes to us with a PhD in philosophy from Cambridge University, a couple of honorary doctorates, an education as a barrister at the Inns of Court London, and a long teaching career. He has authored over 40 books, a body of work that is impressively interdisciplinary. I've not yet had time to read all of these books, but I would like to mention one of my favorites, entitled Death Devoted Heart, Sex and the Sacred in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. This astonishing book, through musical and philosophical analysis, allowed me to appreciate the beauty and depth of Wagner's opera like never before. It did so by showing me the possibility of a metaphysical pleasure that one can take in seeing our contingency as individuals and what it would mean to be able to overcome that contingency. It also showed me how music can explain the condition of man to himself and how he might be able to embrace that condition if only he were brought up in a different way. I expect that Dr. Scruton's thoughts on architecture will be no less meaningful and penetrating for me. At St. John's, we don't read much, if anything, about architecture. What comes to mind is only Schopenhauer's discussion of it, which we read in the music tutorial. Schopenhauer claims that the aim of architecture is to, quote, elucidate the objectification of the will at the lowest grade of its visibility, where it shows itself as the dumb striving of the mass, devoid of knowledge and conforming to law, unquote. Perhaps Dr. Scruton will in some indirect way challenge that claim. What Mr. Scruton will directly speak about, as we know from the brief description of his talk, is the importance of architecture for a humane education, one that will allow us to settle down. I find this idea intriguing and wonder if a humane education is, for Dr. Scruton, the same as a liberal education. Or is it rather that being liberally educated makes it possible for us to treat others humanely? For I must admit that I find unsettling the notion that the goal of liberal education is settling down. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. Please join me in welcoming Roger Scruton.
Thank you, Michael Golliber, for that kind introduction. I'm very honored to be asked to give this lecture, and I'm grateful to Dean Sterling and to St. John's College. This is my first visit here, and I must say It is a most impressive institution, and if it's surprising that it's lasted 50 years, it's only because such a thing must arouse intense opposition among the semi-educated. But nevertheless, it's obviously going strong, and I wish it another 1,000 years. I chose to talk about architecture for the reason that Michael has already hinted at, that when people study liberal arts syllabus, at least as I know it, they tend to concentrate on the written word. Sometimes they branch out into music. They have the example of the quadrivium, the medieval curriculum, which emphasized music as part of it. But the visual tends to be overlooked, and in particular that aspect of the visual which is part of all of our education, the way in which we, as social beings, try to fit our environment to ourselves and ourselves to our environment. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll begin from a definition of madness. The mad person wants a total solution, even when, especially when there is no problem. And if you think about it, it's obvious that all the most influential people in our time have been mad. Lenin, Hitler, Stalin, Mao. Just look back at their, not just at their deeds, but at their writings, and you will find unmistakable elements of paranoia. But it's true too in architecture. Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus, Le Corbusier especially, the architectural guru of the interwar years, right down to the starchitects as they're called today, like Libeskind and Richard Rogers. And I'll give you an example here of Le Corbusier's plan for Paris. There it is. There's the solution. But the question is, what was the problem? Well, here is the problem. Normal, natural human beings in a beautiful, humane environment. Clearly unacceptable. Now, as you know, Le Corbusier's plan was never put into action, although he put a great deal of pressure on the mayor of Paris to put it into action. He was finally able, during the war, when he was architectural advisor to the Vichy government, to impose it on the citizens of Algiers by overruling the mayor of Algiers, but he never got much of it built. But what did happen is, well, I'll show in a minute, is a first attempt at putting it into practice. Now, this brings me to the topic of humane education. What should it be? Obviously, we must learn not to be mad. This is the hardest thing, because this is the most tempting solution to life. A madman doesn't have to communicate with others. He communicates only with himself. There's no limit to his schemes. All he needs is the means to take over the world. Sometimes people withhold those means, but other times, rather too often, they provide them. So a madman, to overcome this madness, the first thing to do is that we must understand boundaries. There are boundaries in conduct, in thought, in feeling, in relations, beyond which we should not go, or at which we must ask at least permission to go. And humility consists in the knowledge of these boundaries. We try to adapt our behavior and our way of life to the fabric of the actual. And you saw a little bit of that fabric with that old boy on his bicycle in Paris. And in literature too, this is what we learn. We learn to sympathize with other forms of life, with other people, with other thoughts, and we learn not to play God. Professor Ricks made a very useful distinction yesterday between identifying with someone and sympathizing with them. He complained that his students only responded to a work of literature when they could say, "Oh yes, I identify with that." But of course, identifying with something means transgressing the boundary. It means going across from your realm into the realm of the other and to a certain extent extinguishing him. Real sympathy means maintaining the boundaries while also recognizing the validity of what's beyond them. And in literature, this means understanding things like the right word, the right phrase, the right way to express a feeling or to engage with another person. And this is shown in dialogue. The great writers are those who can manage dialogue. And in architecture, it's shown to some extent with the experience of the right texture, producing the texture of the city, or the texture of your room, the texture of your house. And this is the little bit of Paris that did suffer from Le Corbusier's mad scheme. It's not his scheme, but it's the same idea. Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers managed to get permission from the mayor of Paris, who had been forced into this by President Pompidou, because this was to be a monument to Pompidou's presidency, and a very appropriate one too, which is the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which is supposed to be a kind of palace devoted to the arts. This is where you come to see exhibitions, to hear excruciating modern music and so on. Of course, it has its defenders, but none of them live in that part of Paris. So, now this brings me to a little piece of philosophy. Already, Eva Brown, in her excellent talk this afternoon, touched on some of these questions. In our ordinary reasoning and thinking about things, we distinguish means and ends. Of course, there are problems that we need to solve. It's not just that madmen have the idea of problems. We do try and solve our problems, and especially in the realm of architecture. We build things for a use, as this college was built. And so we do make use of instrumental reasoning. But we can reason instrumentally, reason as to what is the appropriate thing to perform a certain function and so on, without creating an entirely instrumentalized world. A world in which everything has a function and fits together like a machine, but nobody is clear as to why you should bother to set the machine in motion. What are you trying to achieve by it? Now, at a certain stage, architects worried about this with the birth of the modern architectural materials and modern ways of building. And in particular, Louis Sullivan, the great architect in himself, whose work everybody knows from Chicago, he argued that in architecture, function is all important and that form follows function. So you've got to get the function right, and then the form will shape itself around the function and be beautiful for that very reason. But actually, that is the opposite of the truth, in my view. It's function that follows form. And I want to give you 2 examples about this in a minute. But just to make a general philosophical point, the means that we need to achieve an end are discovered. But what about the end? How do you get knowledge of the ends, of what you really are trying to achieve? This is surely part of what education is supposed to be giving us, a sense that some things are worth pursuing, other things not, a sense that when having achieved those things that are worth pursuing, we have arrived at a goal which casts credit not only on us, but on the whole process which led to this conclusion. And ends are very difficult things to teach. They're not so much discovered as revealed. They're revealed in art, they're revealed in religion, they're revealed in our personal lives and in the whole realm of intimacy and love, which each of us tries to create for himself. But unfortunately, when we concentrate purely on function, we create a world without ends, the purely functionalist city. And that is what Rogers and Piano celebrate in that work that I just showed you, this thing. It's a world in which even art is a machine. Here's just to illustrate the point. I show you the distinction between means and ends in London. There are 2 buildings in the foreground and 3 crammed together in the background. The 3 in the background are clearly devoted to a function, harboring as many office workers in a state as near to suicide as possible for as long as possible. The function is clear, but there's nothing to them apart from that function, and the result, of course, is total ugliness. They're a blight on the city. On the left-hand side is the Bank of England, built for a function, but actually with all kinds of other things going on in it now, but built in particular with an eye to the street, a long colonnade on the street which keeps the atmosphere of the city in place, the texture of the city, without destroying it. On the right is the old Stock Exchange building, another classical building. Neither of these can be demolished because they are obviously national monuments and very beautiful. Interestingly, the Stock Exchange building no longer harbours the Stock Exchange. There's a rather wonderful restaurant inside, offices and other functions, and the thing is moving on all the time. And it's a very good illustration of the fact that in this case, function follows form. There is the beautiful form, and people try to find functions to fit it. The buildings in the background, when their function is ended, they will have to be demolished at huge financial and also environmental cost. Here's another example. This is the transformer station in Islington. I'm sorry about the stop sign, I couldn't remove that. But this was built as an electricity transformer station. And a really wonderful piece of architecture in a street, fitting into the atmosphere of the street. It now contains shops, restaurants, and offices again. And people decided to keep it, and of course, it being there has added huge kudos to the businesses inside, who flourish partly because of the attractiveness of the building where they are. Right, so that's very obvious, and it brings me to the question of aesthetic judgment. What is it that we do when we judge these things, some as good and some as bad, and try and make choices? This is one of the great questions of philosophy to which I have devoted much of my largely futile life. I mean futile because I'd never been able to persuade people that there is such a thing as aesthetic judgment, even though it seems obvious to me. But in the 18th century, when people first began to take an interest in this, they made a distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. They said that there is an aspect of the human condition which causes us to make these judgments of things and say that we like this, we don't like that, we want to be with this, we don't want to be with that, and so on. But they weren't all the same kind of judgment. Sometimes people judge things as beautiful when they are serene and welcoming and comforting. Sometimes when they're frightening and wild, like an open desert or a storm at sea. We can't call them beautiful, but we still find them aesthetically appealing, and we call them sublime. And that's probably a perfectly reasonable distinction, but there are a lot of other distinctions too. We call things dainty, elegant, or dumpy and squat. You know, all sorts of words come to mind when we make these aesthetic judgments, which we use to justify our choices. And they all, in the end, come down to a single set of ideas, that some things are right and some things are wrong. Some things fit and some things don't fit. And that's obvious from the example of London, isn't it? The buildings in the background, they don't fit either to each other or to the city. The buildings in the foreground do seem to fit, and they seem to fit to each other. So they seem to be right. Now, trying to understand this was something, it has been a huge philosophical problem over the years, and this is the only bit of philosophy I'll impose on you. But the greatest philosopher of aesthetics was Immanuel Kant, who argued that although these judgments are in some sense subjective, that's to say they depend upon our responses to things, the way we feel about them, we are nevertheless compelled to seek agreement. We are suitors for agreement. We want others to share our judgments. And when they don't, and when they impose their judgments on us without consultation, we can be offended. More than offended, we might actually want to impose our view upon theirs. It's one reason why we have such complicated legislation about zoning and town planning and so on. So aesthetic judgments are judgments to be shared. If we think that this is not true, that we can all live in our own subjective views, it's partly because we're thinking only of some narrow area, where perhaps we disagree about paintings or about music. You like pop music and I like classical and so on, and who's going to settle the argument? That's true that there in certain areas it's very difficult to come to agreement, but there are areas in which agreement is absolutely essential, and those are the areas where all of us are making judgments. It's what I call the aesthetics of everyday life. Here's an illustration of it. Children already make these judgments. The human being almost jumps from the womb with an aesthetic agenda. And his mother responds to it, and he to the mother likewise. And here you see in the faces of those two children what Wittgenstein would call the natural expression of aesthetic judgment. They're trying to get it right. They're trying to fit those plates and cups and bowls onto the table so that it looks right. And that's all part of arranging it for a ceremonial occasion, and they're arranging it primarily for others. You can see the role of the aesthetic judgment is not just in expressing the individual taste of each of those little girls, it's in preparing the whole table for a community. And that's one of the things that people tend to forget about aesthetic judgment, that it is essentially outward directed towards other people. And it's why aesthetic education matters. It doesn't, not because it matters to you, though it does, but because it matters to all of us. And what matters here, of course, is the way in which we make forms, the way in which we compose things, the way in which we get things fitting together. The form of the form of things is understood because we can understand the relation between the part and the whole, between the crockery on the table and the shape of the table, between the colours of each dish and the colours of its neighbours, and so on. The part-whole idea is absolutely fundamental to our way of arranging things. And in everyday life, we build in this way towards some kind of completion, as when we lay a table, like those two girls, or when we furnish a room. We do this by creating forms, but these forms become apparent only through the light, the shade, and mouldings. This is something I'm going to go on to in a second. The shadows and mouldings create a kind of grammar of form, and this grammar imitates things that we find elsewhere in our love of beauty and of art. In every area of aesthetic judgment, we look for some kind of regularity, convention, rule-guidedness that enables us to judge. And those little girls, they have a mathematical sense of how things should be arranged on each side of the table and where the object should go. And they're putting things together according to a grammar that they've learned, partly through being taught and partly instinctively. Here's an example of a form without grammar. This is Edmonton Library, an architectural masterpiece of recent years, where you see fluid forms which have no obvious part-whole relation to each other. They are simply wrapped together and dumped in the street. This is a very famous example of a deviant grammar. This is Michelangelo's staircase in the Laurentian Library, where he uses all the forms of Baroque architecture, or Mannerist architecture, and uses them in completely eccentric ways. You will see the columns that are embedded in the wall standing on consoles, those little rounded things that stick out of the wall, as though they didn't need to be held up by anything in particular. And the staircase flows all over the place. But nevertheless, it has an extraordinary atmosphere of both serenity and energy. And people used to teach architecture so that this basic relation of part to whole and part to part was part of the discipline. This is what aesthetic education was for architects in the 19th century. This drawing comes from a textbook used at the Pratt School in New York, which shows, obviously, components of a Tuscan column and how they fit together, how the cornice, how the architrave fits on the capital and so on, but drawn in such a way that the student also learns how the light falls on it, where the shadows are cast. And part of the education was to learn to draw those shadows. And there's hardly an architect today, I think, who could actually draw the shadow on a Corinthian capital in the middle of the day. This is something that requires, 3 months of learning. But it is essential to knowing how the parts fit together. And this is one reason why mouldings matter. This is just a very simple example of a door surround. You'll see these all over architecture in America, right up until about 1950. And you can probably still get from the timber merchant these kind of mouldings if you want to put them around a door. And it is the right way to put things around a door because it creates a proper edge. And the edge is not created by the wood, it's created by the shadows. And that's something, and those shadows have to be themselves sculpted in this way. They are, as it were, created by the coming together of parts. Just to illustrate this, this is a Gothic moulding, obviously, where you see exactly how the Gothic architects used this in order to articulate their buildings and make them glow with a sort of inner life. But that life comes, of course, from the light that falls on them. And here's another example, a very ordinary example. This is a wall on the left-hand side I'm particularly pointing to, which is in Prague, and the wall of the garden of a palace, where you see what would otherwise be a huge and rather ugly expanse tamed by a moulding, by the cornice along the top, and a string course down the middle, and a tiny little lamp sticking out at one place and a little door at another. All of this gives it a sense of being a composition and not just a block. This was carried over, it's familiar to all of you from Manhattan, all of you have been to Manhattan, where the architecture that was used to build that city in the 19th century was entirely influenced by what architects learned in school then, which was exactly composing things in that way. No serious architect would say that this was done correctly, and of course the absurd fire regulations have made it rather hideous in one respect. But even so, you can learn to block out the fire escapes and still see those rather gay and elaborate Corinthian columns holding up irrelevant cornices all over the bottom of Manhattan. Interesting enough, although of course these are very rough and ready things, they do illustrate the difference that is made by a bit of aesthetic education. The difference being that these buildings are now protected. And not only are they protected, but they have a different function just about every 10 years. They can change use because, as I said before, function follows form. Once you have a beautiful form, people fit their life into it. And although this form, as I say, is very ordinary in many ways, there's hardly a person living in Manhattan who wouldn't like to live in one of these. And this is rather contrast. This is an example from Zaha Hadid, our most famous British architect of Iraqi origins, who creates form without that composition of part and part. This is obviously never been built, designed at a computer, and designed really in the spirit of a motor car. It doesn't stand up. It wants to fly. It has an unsettled character. Now, if you imagined a whole city built like that, you would realize that not only would the architecture be unsettled, but the people would be too. And here's an example of seriously unsettled architecture, which is the MIT building in in Cambridge, Massachusetts, built by Frank Gehry, which sort of speaks for itself. It is an extremely interesting building, of course. Nobody can deny that it's interesting. It's very eye-catching. But the architect is now obviously suffering a very expensive lawsuit because it turns out to be unusable. It leaks at every joint and so on. Here is another example from Norman Foster, the City Hall in London, which is a kind of great blob of jelly thrown down by a giant child, which has landed in the middle of the City of London, which is carefully designed so that nothing could possibly sit next to it. It is there to exclude humanity and to exclude residents from any space within vicinity. But there you are, there it is. And again, of course, you can't imagine the function changing. It contains civil servants who turn up there every day, I assume. Right, now, why have we had this sort of imposition of all these extravagant forms, and why have we lost that old education in architecture? Were we right to have that old education? Should we have held on to it? And are these new forms really to be preferred? Aren't they more appropriate to the times in which we live? Well, one of the arguments that's constantly made in this area is the argument from genius and originality. The argument that in all artistic endeavors, originality is necessary. It's the sine qua non. Without it, you're not really engaged in serious artistic activity at all. And this means that only the genius can really take part in it. This idea, again, has its origins in the 18th century, was very influential in the philosophy of Kant, that art is the realm where genius is sovereign, and without genius, somehow you haven't entitled yourself to enter that domain. And that might be true that in many areas genius is required. But there's an argument put forward very eloquently by T.S. Eliot in his famous essay on tradition and the individual talent, to the effect that although this is absolutely true that the original talent must be there, otherwise the tradition will die, so must the tradition be there. That provides the context within which genius can be observed and within which originality can be practiced. Just doing something that hasn't been done before, when it shows no understanding of what has been done before and what has been intended by what has been done before, is not originality. It's merely unpredictability. And there's a kind of fake originality that arises when people make no effort either to understand or to fit in to what already exists, and simply do something which is their own thing. So real originality is founded on respect for tradition and an attempt to adapt to that tradition and to adapt the tradition to yourself. And that's the real contrast you see between the Michelangelo staircase I showed you and Norman Foster's blob of jelly. And I think this is where aesthetic education really matters. Aesthetic education is about embracing that tradition, understanding it, and defining your own efforts in terms of it. It's fine to make a cult of genius, as our ancestors did in the 18th and 19th century, but they never intended by that cult to sweep away the inheritance of the arts that they had so much enjoyed. On the contrary, they wanted to make an original contribution to that inheritance. And you see, especially in the art of music in the 19th century, the way in which the tonal tradition, already in existence for 1,000 years, was not cast aside, but adapted and taken to its limits. Now, again, there's another point to be made, which is perhaps more important for the case of architecture, which is that it's a mistake anyway to transfer this idea to architecture. The mistake is precisely that architecture is a practical art. It's there to fulfill functions. We all need it to be done. And all of us take part in it. Okay, most of you are no good at it, but all of you have probably built a garden shed or put up a shelf. You've all offended your a roommate by something or other, and had to realize that you didn't yet know. You know, so architecture is just the largest scale of that ordinary practical activity which you saw exemplified by those two schoolgirls. So it's something that we all do, and we know that we're not all geniuses. So it must be, therefore, that there is a right way to do it, which is accessible to people who are not geniuses. And that's the majority of architects. And I think this is one reason, again, why Manhattan looks okay, is because nobody with the impression of his own genius got round to touching it until Frank Lloyd Wright came along with the Guggenheim Museum. Now, there are geniuses in architecture, of course, like Michelangelo, and in particular, a favorite of mine, Borromini, the Italian Baroque architecture. I'll just show you two of his cupolas from Rome. This is the cupola of San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, the smallest church in Rome, in which he's managed to concentrate every single detail with every single liturgical significance into a space about the size of that screen there. And here is his great cupola from Sant'Ivo della Sapienza. But now you see there a very good illustration of why mouldings are necessary. There's a building with absolutely sharp edges where every geometrical relation is dramatized, but it's only possible, isn't it, because of the shadows that cling to every parallel line. And he knew that, of course, and that was what he had been taught too. Here's another example. Is this original? This is, you know, a popular diversion in a place where there aren't many. Of course, this is like anybody can say, you know, it's never been done before to put an upside-down house and make it work, so I've done it. And interesting enough, you only know this is an upside-down house because it's built according to the classical principles. So this is about, you know, it's an interesting paradox that here is a house that, although it's a joke, it wouldn't have been perceived in the way that the architect wanted if the architect hadn't studied how to do a real house. So these examples show, I think, that the need in architecture generally, the need for rules and patterns. Without the sense of detail, we can't learn how to compose things. We compose things by assembling parts. But we don't only assemble the parts of the building to make a building, we also learn to fit a building into its setting. This is something which is very familiar to people in Santa Fe because, of course, you have zoning laws and architectural regulations which are designed to make buildings fit into this landscape and to fit next to each other if possible, and you know, with the right colors and shapes and heights and so on. So this is a unique part of the United States where people clearly have perceived the need for this and acted on it. But it's not just because it looks nice, it's because that's a way of perpetuating the idea of settlement. When we settle down in a home of our own, it's very rare that we do it on our own, and if we did do it always on our own, the human race would die out, and rightly so. So when we settle down to share a home, and usually to create new human beings who share it with us too. And I think this deep idea of settlement connected with the whole reproductive cycle of the human species is one that is embodied in our traditional classical vernacular forms. These are there because they're part of sharing our environment. We build in the way that our neighbors would like, in a way that our neighbors could fit to, in this kind of side-by-side relation. But at a certain stage, largely under the influence of the madman Corbusier, people started thinking in another way, in terms of a kind of horizontal horizontal lines which stretch forever. And they arose a kind of tyranny of the horizontal. It's very easy to build horizontally if you're using reinforced concrete and steel girders and so on. And this became the norm. And here on the left-hand side, and not a very good picture, I'm afraid, this is a street in New York. There you see a fairly normal piece of modern rubbish in the horizontal style. There's hardly a vertical line in it, or if there is, it doesn't mean anything, compared with quite a lot of verticals which harmonize on the right-hand side. When my family was in Manchester, the family from which I came originally, they were a working-class family who lived in slums like this. This is a Birmingham slum, which is one of those which has escaped the health and safety regulations and is still standing. And there you see a long terrace of houses on a nice curve, entirely composed out of vertical parts. And okay, it needs a bit of gentrification, but it looks okay. But over most of the United Kingdom at a certain stage, people started tearing these things down and replacing them with the horizontal style. This is Tower Hamlets in London, long streets in the air. There are a few sort of vertical struts, but basically all the movement is from left to right. Here it is on the street. You see no people in the street, just dustbins. And needless to say, this is a great problem estate. It has the highest concentration of crime in all of London. And you should contrast it with the ordinary old-fashioned street like this, which is all built side to side, but in each house manifests a vertical order of its own. There's no, they're completely different heights. The windows are at different heights. Nothing really is the same from one house to another, but as you can see, it's a perfectly relaxed and harmonious composition. And the proof of it is, of course, that all the people out in the street enjoying it. And I think this is a lesson that people are beginning to learn, that you don't build horizontally, you build vertically. Of course, you need the horizontal lines too, but you must learn that way of sanding one thing or another, which is taught, or sanding one thing on another, which is taught by the classical orders that I illustrated earlier. So, some general remarks about settlement. We all need to settle down, and culture is part of this. We want to perpetuate the voices that have already settled the land before us. That's one reason why we read great books. And we encounter beauty every day, but it's one that we need to learn to bring to our side. We need to use our sense of beauty so that our settlements are indeed communal things that we share where we are at home, from which we don't particularly want to move. And in a genuine settlement, we're in a position to make a gift of both of the buildings that we make and our life in those buildings, a gift to the stranger as well as to the friend. And I think in that way, aesthetic education is part of responding to the deep needs of the species, especially the need to fit in. And the classical vernacular, which I've really been defending, is not a style, it's a grammar. It's like tonality in music. It has a history, but it involves reaching out for permanence. There were geniuses, Palladio, Michelangelo, and so on, and they were very important because they made the little parts that the rest of us use whenever we're building our own little garden shed. But once the grammar is in place, it is learnable and transferable, and it's tied to no specific use, like those Manhattan lofts. And I think those lofts and all those ordinary buildings I've been showing you illustrate the priority of aesthetic values. Once things look right, we find the way of putting them to a use. They've got to look right first of all, and then everything else will fit in. And that's what makes an adaptable city. But of course, we human beings, you know, we don't just compose the things around us in this way. We also want to be composed, especially when dead. I think all of us want to leave this life in a fairly orderly way and be remembered as something that's not a particularly chaotic example of human existence. That's why you'll find that funeral parlours, even in this quite fairly modern building, will tend again to take on board these classical principles. You know, mouldings, shadows, there's classical lettering and so on. Okay, it's not exactly as it might have been, but it's something that people will be immediately attracted to if they're looking for somewhere to dispose of their bodies. Here, by contrast, is a funeral parlour that failed. And you can see exactly why. It's not just that puce colour, supermarket colour for the signs. It's also, this is composed out of Bauhaus details, those pilotti that hold up the canopy above the door, the window shapes, the metal-framed windows and so on, and the flat roof. And it's a very interesting example of how to do everything wrong. Okay, so I think I might just, yes, okay, just the final points that, so architecture stands up, it doesn't flow, but we are seeing increasingly the triumph of the gas station style. Gas stations were one of the great tragedies for the architectural tradition that we inherited, because they are all on the horizontal canopies, and they have to have huge billboards to attract the cars in and so on. Everything about them is a challenge, and I think this is a challenge that's never been risen to. Proportion, however, means measuring things, and measuring means parts, and all the things that I've shown you that I regard as acceptable are composed rather than moulded. The building of Zaha Hadid I showed you is a moulded form, as was that library from Edmonton. Much more, we notice things like edges and close parallels and corners and the play of light, because they are what make buildings stand before us and stand in a serene way. But we seem to have lost the art of doing that and replaced it with what I call the kitchen utensil style. And I think we can understand a lot of what's happened in modern design if we look back at kitchen utensils. Here's the kettle that your grandmother had on the open hearth in her farmhouse, right? Something like this. And the first thing you notice about it is that it's composed, isn't it? Composed from meaningful parts. The handle has been turned, and it's held up on brackets which have ornamental details. Again, the lid, likewise, has been turned and has a kind of moulded effect with shadows everywhere and so on. And it's got a string course around the middle. It's like a little small-scale version of what a classical architect would produce. But there's a history here. At a certain stage, this kind of design took over, where people wanted a fluidity and a simplicity which seemed to be more in accordance with the lifestyle of the forward-looking American housewife. This wasn't Granny's kettle. This was the upwardly mobile wife's kettle. And it was soon replaced by this, which is the mistress's kettle. There's no permanent relationship behind this, but nevertheless there's a total fluidity of form. And at a certain stage, there arose the cult of the hairdryer, this idea that you take completely plastic forms and shape them together, fitting them so that they mold into each other without any details at all. All you can do is put silly images on them like that. And this seems to be as far as the education of the architect goes these days. And I'll conclude with an example. This is Slough bus station, the architect doesn't even have a human name. So this example of, obviously, an out-of-place kitchen appliance is not unusual. And you'll find it, now I've drawn your attention to it, you'll be seeing it everywhere. And the great question is, what do we do with this rubbish? It's never going to change its use. Even as a bus station, it doesn't work. It'll have to be pulled down and thrown away. But then the question is, what do you throw it into? The landfill sites are filling up beyond our capacity to replace them. The only thing I think of is a properly classically designed dustbin. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
We're going to take some questions now.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for your talk. It strikes me that we might have diverging views on some of the elements that you've presented tonight. And let me quote two things from the traditions that you've mentioned. First, in 18th century England, we have this definition of beauty, which is diversity in uniformity. And then in Kant, we have the idea that art's rules are given by nature. Now, I agree with you that there is absolutely no way originality, genius can happen without rules. That is for certain. However, must they always be tradition's rules? And if that's the case, is tradition not an enclosed, sort of total legal realm to which we adapt, a total solution, if you will, that we would be mad to follow if we follow your definition of madness? And as an example, I would like to quote two architects, 20th century, that you've not named, which I think illustrate my point very well. Gaudi in Barcelona and Frank Lloyd Wright, whose, in both cases, their works were influenced by nature, yet answered to the settled and social nature of humanity as well, but questioned the tradition in important ways. So knowledge of the tradition is important, but it's not sufficient to account for beauty.
Right, well, that's a very good and complex question. And what I would say in response, obviously you're coming from the philosophical angle. The first thing I would say is that rules in architecture are, you could put it in Kant's way and say they're given by nature. A better way is to say that they are the byproducts of successful solutions. The classical style is not a body of rules laid down a priori. It's something, it's the, if you like, the resume of inherited knowledge. So it doesn't work like a convention, and it doesn't constrain like a convention. It can be adapted and pushed in new directions. And I think that is exactly what was happening at a certain stage. Frank Lloyd Wright is a very good example of some of the principles I've been talking about, because he was somebody who was utterly clear about the need for close parallels and the need for shadows and so on, and the need for forms with which people felt at home and so on. It's a very eccentric architecture, however. You can't imagine a city built by Frank Lloyd Wright. You can imagine expensive houses for extremely wealthy people in the countryside, which is what he was most adept at. And I think, Gaudi, of course, is a very interesting example too, but he is, again, someone he arose out of the native Gothic and Baroque traditions of Spain and did his own thing, and it fitted in. What my argument is not that such geniuses should be forbidden or even controlled, provided there's some kind of overall conception of what they're doing, but that we should provide an education for people who are not geniuses. That is the great difficulty in architecture, that most buildings are built by people who are not geniuses and can't be entitled to take that kind of step. So, and that's where we need a greater respect for these traditional forms and traditional ways of building. I haven't got a chairman, so don't blame me if I ignore you. It's the general principle that microphones don't work in
Yes.
St. John's. Oh, no.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scruton. I enjoyed your lecture quite a lot. In your talk, you valorize sharp edges and right angles and moldings and such. And you also briefly give a nod to the local Pueblo style, which I'm not a local. This is my first encounter with the Pueblo style, and I'm really quite fascinated with it. But it has a near total lack of sharp edges and right angles and moldings. And I wonder if you see or can see a logic or a grammar in that tradition, one which is very different from the classical tradition?
Yes, there is. And people have tried to maintain it in Santa Fe. It's a grammar for a small village, really. It's not a grammar for a great town. And it's everything is handed over to the interior or to the windows, as the articulate exterior of the building. But of course, it's it's not that everything has to be done according to the things that I was pointing out. I was simply pointing out those things that have traditionally been taught and which have enabled architects to build in all sorts of places according to whatever the functional need is.
I'm just hoping to. I would like you to say more about the connection between beauty and settling, and specifically, I'm wondering if there's any sense in which you think that beauty might be or should be unsettling.
Yeah, this is one reason why those 18th century philosophers distinguished the beautiful and the sublime. They didn't necessarily put it in quite that way, but they recognized that there are things which we find intensely moving and important in the way that beautiful things are, which are nevertheless unsettling. So those are the sublime things that, as it were, point out to us that we're not really at home in the world. And like the great storm at sea, the huge mountain, and so on, and likewise in art, there are there's tragedy as well as the ordinary narrative forms of art, and tragedy has an essentially disturbing quality. So it's absolutely true that our aesthetic sense isn't only devoted to the idea of settling down, but what I would say is this, that if we don't settle down, nothing else really comes across to us. It's only through being settled down that we can be unsettled, and that the sense of beauty is a fundamental element in the gestures that are required to settle down. It's a way in which we adjust the appearances of things so that I and my neighbors can share them. Beauty is all about appearances, and appearances really matter. If you create appearances which nobody feels comfortable with, then they're going to move on. So that is one of the functions of the sense of beauty, in my view. And the aesthetic sense is wider than the sense of beauty, and the sense of beauty itself depends upon that deeper thing, that distinction between right and wrong that we make when assembling appearances for ourselves. Where are we with the microphone?
Thank you, Dr. Scruton. This was great tonight. I guess the one question I had, looking at all the modern buildings, contemporary buildings that you pointed out to us, the thing that was most powerful to me in a way was their shapes, obviously, and the things you were pointing out, but also their monumentality. And I'm just wondering whether there's something, in a way, more egregious about what in what you're pointing out when the buildings are monumental as opposed to when there's a kind of smallness. And the most recent example of a kind of David versus Goliath battle between two modern buildings was the MoMA dismantling of that small, what is it, American Folk Art Museum in Manhattan. And needless to say, that small museum suddenly had all these supporters, even though that was also a very contemporary modern building. Maybe it had more verticality, I don't know, but I'm just curious whether there's something about the monumentality versus smallness.
No, you're right. I didn't say anything about scale, and of course I should have done. The gentleman who asked me about the Pueblo style here was obviously referring to something that makes sense only in this sort of kind of miniature, these miniature forms in a landscape which absorbs them. If you put a great concrete block on one of the hills here, I imagine that all the residents of Santa Fe would feel exactly like you would, like the New Yorkers felt about demolition of that museum. Scales. Again, I would say this: that scales have to be composed. You have to build up to those huge things out of parts which are independently significant. This is something you see very beautifully achieved in the Chrysler Building in New York. That's a building which stands very high, well, very high for its time, but it stands on the street, and it's entirely composed out of meaningful architectural parts which are echoed all the way up the building and also in the interior, and it's as it were, a respectable citizen of the street. Its scale becomes horrifying when it has no detail to illustrate the way it's composed.
Sorry. When you were showing the pictures of the verticality and the examples of that, especially the row of houses in the slums of London, it really brought up for me an association with really the uprightness of the human form. And I was just wondering if that's something that informs classical style as you understand it, and if so, can we generalize some kind of aesthetic principles from the human form itself?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, that's a good point. It goes back to the point that the gentleman raised at the beginning. You can generalize in aesthetics, but only up to a point. Only because you can say that these principles have shown themselves to be acceptable. These are the solutions that we've adopted, and we can adapt them to new areas and so on. It doesn't follow that there couldn't be a completely different way of building, say, elsewhere in another climate or with a different kind of people. And it's interesting, the traditional Japanese architecture is more horizontal than vertical. Things slide. Of course, they're made of paper and so on because of the earthquake problem and all the rest. Completely different problems were being confronted. Although Japanese temples are organized vertically like other sacred buildings. But it's true that the classical architects that I've been referring to did begin their training by drawing the human figure, and it was accepted from the Greeks onwards, and certainly by Vitruvius, that you understand the column by understanding the way that people stand. That this is the translation into stone of the standing figure, and it should have the elasticity and the readiness of the human body, and that's something that you do see once you get used to it.
how did we get from there to here? In other words, following your examples of the Bank of England and the old stock exchange, the only thing they have in common, obviously, is money. But when did or how did architects morph from artist into con artist?
Into?
Con artist. They trick people into thinking this is pretty good stuff.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, into conners. Well, there's always a motive for faking something if there's money attached to the thing. You know, going back to the buildings in London, those huge blocks of completely unmodulated concrete, there was a lot of money involved in building those. And if you got planning permission to put up a building that high, you could walk away from it as a millionaire and invest your proceeds in the nice little cottage in the country that you'd always wanted. You know, and that's how London got destroyed. And one of the things that the Prince of Wales has been very concerned with is how to create a new kind of architectural education so that architects don't even propose such things, you know, so that they come up with a scheme which is designed to fit in with the city, to express its dignity and so on. And obviously that is the way forward through education, but money gets in the way. And if you reward uneducated things, you get uneducated buildings, you know. There's two people in the front here. Oh, right, sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, how does form follow function when existing structures change their use?
Well, it doesn't. That's what I'm trying to say, that function follows form. Once the form is there, as in that example I showed you, remember, of the Islington transformer station, the form is there and perfected, and people love it. The local council said that's got to stay. And the functions follow it. They are adapted into it. So the shops have to be fitted inside that form, and the restaurants and so on. And they're incredibly popular, the shops and the restaurants, because it's just a nice place to be. And we shouldn't be, it's just an example of illustrating the fact that we adapt our means to our ends, which is how it should be, and not our ends to our means.
Are you saying that the niceness, the appeal, is really the form, and then the function just seeks an attractive venue and fits itself to it?
Well,
it doesn't seem to be a fit between form and function in that scheme, really.
No, it's of course it's not. What I'm saying is that what Louis Sullivan said, that form follows function, is the opposite of the truth, right? That you don't get a nice form by simply revealing or following the function, as Piano and Rogers pretend they're doing in the Centre Pompidou. The form is something that you understand completely independently.
Yeah. So I'm glad that Mr. Grenke asked that, because I'm also confused about why you're saying what you're saying about form and function, because it seems to me that the examples of postmodern architecture that you showed us are examples of form completely taking over any thought of function. So it becomes all about form and not about function, and not about dwelling, or not about being in the building, but about being far away from it, looking at it. Whereas, the examples you pointed to in London, the stock exchange, and those seem to me to be, the beauty of the form comes from a certain deep thinking about the function, the original function.
Yeah. The deep thinking is actually about form. It's thinking about how forms are understood by human beings. They're understood in terms of their parts and how those parts fit together. The postmodern things that you were referring to don't have proper parts. and the form is arbitrary as a result. We don't see the form as it were, growing out of the construction. It's simply imposed, and those things are, of course, designed on a computer. They're not designed by somebody who's looked at something and drawn it and seen how it would fit into something else. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. The word form maybe is not a word that I would naturally use, but it's there because Louise Sullivan made that remark. And I was just trying to say that that remark is the opposite of the truth.
Mr. Scruton, can I ask you to say more about architecture and death, or settling down and death? Because I remember you talked a lot, or you dwelled on the fact that the funeral homes fail or succeed based on the aesthetics of how they how people die. They don't want to end and be remembered as living a chaotic life, and that seems to me and which is very interesting for me, because when I ask people my age or young people who live in cities, and they prefer to even though they prefer to live in cities when they're young, I ask them, what are you going to do when you get older or when you retire? I find most of them saying they want to go live in the country, where they have nice homes with the gardens, going back to nature. That's what I hear them say. And I was wondering about this relation between what is it about the latter part of your life that's close to death, and what could settling down mean for a person about to end one's life, or I just want to know more about that relation.
The funerary architecture has been extremely important in the history of architecture, obviously. When the normal situation of people when they approach death is to become serious and to will some permanent record of themselves. And their relatives likewise. You don't build a monument out of plastic, or a monument is there to perpetuate something. Okay, it's going to decay eventually, but many of the architectural paradigms that we have originated as monuments, and likewise as churches or whatever, places where the dead are honoured or even present. So that death is a very important asset for buildings. It's something which if a building can accommodate the dead, it's achieved something that all buildings in there are, as it were, designed for, namely permanence. And I think, of course, modern attitudes to death are changing, and young people don't think about these things. And there's an intervening period where people want to go to the country, perhaps, and settle down, and that is perhaps not as healthy as it should be. One reason why our towns are so disorganized and why they lose their centres, where they don't have a centripetal movement towards the centre where real life occurs, is because people don't reproduce enough in them. The towns should be full of children, as they used to be in Italy in my youth. And the children give sense to the residents of everybody else. And when people are buried in that society, they're taken out of the town.
Thank you for your lecture. I was curious.
Where are you?
Sorry.
You
What's that?
yeah.
Yes, right over here. I was curious. At one point in the talk, you alluded to the fact that when you had the girls arranging the plates properly on the table, you alluded to the fact that it might also be natural, that this kind of mathematized look at things might be natural. But most of your talk was about education and how to maybe rectify something. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the natural quality of it.
Well, yes. We have many natural capacities which only become fulfilled when educated. You know, it's natural in us to learn language, but to learn it properly, we've got to be educated. Music, likewise, is natural to us, but it also requires education to come to fruition. I took that example of those girls because it's so obvious that they don't have yet any aesthetic principles, nor have they ever considered these questions. They probably don't have the idea of beauty and all that, but they do have the sense of right and wrong, how it should be and how it shouldn't be. And that's where we begin, and it's also where we end. We gradually take into that sense, you know, the sense of the rightness and wrongness, all that we want to build into our shared environment.
Would you please comment on the concept of form following function as a necessity, utilizing the Las Vegas Strip as an example, which, in my view at least, listening to your talk, is the exact example where form does follow function, where it is necessary, and where, as a result, the end result is implosion.
Yes. Well, you won't be surprised to learn that I've devoted quite a bit of my life to avoiding the Las Vegas Strip, so I don't really have any authority to talk about it. But I'm sure you're right. Are there other?
Oh, yeah.
Yes? Oh, no, there's.
Oh, yes. One thing that I was struck by in your talk was your use of a lot of ethical terms to help us think through aesthetic qualities. Things like a sense of community, of friendship, of regard for others, of decorum, of dignity, of humility. And I think it's interesting the ways in which aesthetic categories help us reflect on ethical categories. But I also don't think it's the case that there's a one-to-one relationship between the two, that things that are aesthetically pleasing are always right, good, and just, but they sometimes are, and maybe the categories help us think about one another. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which aesthetic categories in art and architecture around us help us think through ethical issues as well, and that those areas of overlap.
Well, yes, this is one of the great questions of philosophy, what the relation between aesthetic and moral values is. You can't get far with exploring the aesthetic value of something without falling into the arena of ethics. You're bound to be raising questions about in the case of architecture, about the humanity of the environment that it creates, about you attribute to it qualities of, say, of restfulness, or the opposite, that it is challenging in some way, it's energizing. All these words automatically come into your mind when you try to explain what it is that you like or dislike about a building. And in using those words, many of them metaphors, you're making connections between a building and the rest of your life. How you, as it were, receive the Lebenswelt, the world of life in which you live. And the same is true, of course, of literature and music. In all the arts, if you want to get beyond the first observations about how a poet uses a certain word, as to why he should put that word there, you're straight away in the middle of a state of mind which calls upon you to evaluate it. Is it sincere? Is he having himself on, etc.? To what extent should I or should I not sympathize with this particular presentation of the poet's ego? So, I think in every area, the aesthetic judgment begins with a sense of how things impact on me, how I receive them. through the senses or through the unfolding of a drama and so on. But as soon as I reflect on this, I recognize that the impact itself has a moral meaning for me.
Hello? Sure. Hello. Related to, I guess, that question is, how and why do aesthetics judgments change? And then I guess to follow it up would be, when should it?
Well, aesthetic judgments don't all change. If you mean that people's tastes are always changing, there are huge movements of taste, of course, in the history of culture. But there are also the permanent monuments which are always attributed a significance, even if that significance isn't quite the same from generation to generation. Like the poems of Homer, of course, and the things that you read in the Great Books program. They're there because they have stood the test of time. And I think there are things in our nature which are permanent and are addressed by those works of art. They address what those aspects of us which couldn't change without everything else changing. Now, of course, perhaps everything else could change too. Maybe the internet has made everything else change or something. You know, people come up with all kinds of views like that. In the everyday aesthetics, the aesthetics of architecture, clothes, decoration and so on, things change much more quickly because, of course, they change with the changes in everyday life. They are very much on the surface of everyday life. And that's why this problem has arisen, the problem I've been talking about, the problem of how you should educate the architect. Because we've lived through a period of rapid change under the impulse of forces which are not aesthetic, mostly economic or simply the effect of maddening. You know, and that that raises the question for the first time. It wasn't ever raised before. This question of how an architect should be educated, it was just obvious. You look at the examples and you move on from them.
Thanks so much. I have to say that when I look at buildings like the ones that you showed, the modern architecture, I feel kind of like a crazy person myself because I'm like, this is terrible. Why did you let this be built? And so now I know I'm not alone. I appreciate that a lot. So I guess my question is, so you showed a lot of classical architecture and Victorian architecture, and then some of the examples of like the blobs and the, you know, kind of horrific jumbles, which were like usually considered modern architecture. What do you think about, like for example, the public library in Chicago, which is a postmodern architecture that takes the moldings and shadows that you talk about and has verticality, but then it actually makes a pastiche of those.
Yes.
And it ironically, just to describe this public library has a roof that has moldings that look like seashells, but they're enormous. They're just like hundreds of feet tall, and so it's a pastiche on these like classical moldings. So I just wonder, just your aesthetic judgment on kind of that branch of postmodern architecture. Thanks a lot.
Well, my gut reaction is that facetiousness should never be accepted. And it shouldn't be accepted in things which pretend to permanence, like public buildings. Public buildings should not be facetious, they should be dignified. And especially a library which represents for us everything that's most serious in our inheritance. But maybe over the years people will get used to it. I think that moment in architectural history when postmodernists took all the classical details and put them in the wrong places, I think that has gone. You know, it was there partly because people had realized, architects had realized that modernism was not popular, so and people wanted these details, so they decided to put these details in, but as it were, in an abusive way, just to show their contempt for the ordinary person in the street.
Thank you. And thank you. What you say provokes a kind of line of questioning which begins with a quizzical thought. Would any genius want to live in or settle in something that a genius architect had provided for him? And the line also fans out, if what you say is true, which I think it is, then it would be very characteristic of a philosopher if he ever built a building or if he described in his works and treated architecture. In one case, I think of Descartes with the metaphor of flattening everything and replacing it, maybe the first Le Corbusier. But then I want to ask you what you think of Wittgenstein, the building he did in Vienna.
Right, well, that's really two questions. There are examples of geniuses who have built houses in which they have lived. I think Frank Lloyd Wright is one of them. Le Corbusier never managed to live in anything he built, nor has anybody else, as far as I know. Mies van der Rohe, likewise. Wittgenstein's sister, for whom he built that house, never managed to live in it. It became the embassy of an Eastern Bloc communist country. But actually, everything that I said in this lecture is something that Wittgenstein would have agreed with. He didn't like the classical idiom, but he was totally of the view that there was such a thing as an architectural education to do with getting things right and fitting things together and getting parallels to match and creating shadows and so on. So he was the kind of clean modernist whom a classicist would admire, probably. But you know, his building, his house in Vienna, stands to the architectural tradition as the Tractatus stands to the philosophical tradition. It's a dead end.
Hi, I'm over here.
All right. Okay.
I'd like to revisit the idea of monumentality and the way that you describe, say, the blob in London dominates the space around it. And whether that might be an attempt to force people to enter the feeling of being somewhere else. It might be an attempt to have a different and illuminating experience. But whether that might be in ignorance of the possibility of encountering the other with sensible boundaries in a more congruous city.
Well, the explanation of the blob in London is complex. It was the architect Norman Foster never justifies anything he does. He only insists that it should be done and should be noticeable. You know, many people like what he does. That particular thing, I don't know why it was built as it was, but you know, its appearance speaks for itself. I think one should contrast it with the sort of the large buildings that we know from the past, which stand out and seem to elbow everything away from them, and the great problem that people felt they created. Well, the most important example is St. Peter's in Rome, when Modena had really finished working on, well, he hadn't never finished, but he got that facade really in place, and Michelangelo had done his dome. It was so huge, the city around about it was dwarfed. Nobody knew quite what to do about it, but it had to be joined in. It had to be somehow brought down and modulated into the tonality of the surrounding city. So Bernini asked to build that colonnade, which is one of the great architectural achievements, which totally integrated St. Peter's into the city of Rome and would still do so were it not for the fact that Mussolini opened that great street in front of it.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. You talked briefly about art being something that reveals the beautiful or the sublime, and I guess I'm assuming that we're thinking of architecture as being a type of art that can do that. And I'm wondering if we can talk briefly about the relationship between function and beauty then, and what role, if any, the fulfillment of a function plays in the expression of the beautiful, and then I guess if functional types of art like architecture would then be fundamentally different than others in their ability to reveal beauty?
Well, this is a very complex issue. Often we find purely functional objects beautiful, but usually we do so when their function has been lost. You know, people collect old tools and often put them up on their wall, things that were made purely for a function and were never regarded as beautiful by the people who made them. But nevertheless, they strike us as beautiful because there is, as it were, the memory of a function in them, and that memory is translated into aesthetic values. It's as though the ghost of people past is still present in the object, and that is very characteristic of the aesthetic attitude generally. We see, as it were, haunting things, the people who can no longer use them, and I think so. Functional objects often acquire a beauty by losing their function. Doesn't mean that they don't have the beauty when they have the function. There are those objects which are beautiful because they are so functional, or whose beauty is so tied up with their function that you couldn't separate them. Aeroplanes being the obvious example. I've struggled for years with my little sketchbook to design a classical aeroplane, and it's never worked. Something about the moldings that gets in the way of the hydrodynamics or the aerodynamics.
Is this on? Yeah. Nietzsche said that the categories of the aesthetic are learned categories and not a priori, and that beauty and the sublime were historically learned, and that there could be other categories we could learn that were aesthetic judgments that we developed in traditions. And in fact, he proposed the interesting and the boring as aesthetic categories. And the French turned that into the avant-garde, and the avant-garde defined the interesting as the new or the different. And often that was a rejection, or at least a comment on the past forms of beauty, and then it became comments on past attempts to be interesting. And most of the buildings you used to illustrate ugliness were ones that the architects intended to be interesting, knowingly not beautiful. I'd just like your thoughts on that.
Well, again, this is you want me to talk about the whole of aesthetics rather than this particular question that I'm raising. It is true that the values that or rather the aesthetic values that we are tempted to articulate are indefinitely many, and they change from time to time and place to place. And of course, any critic can get away with saying it's interesting. And there are a lot of things that are interesting to look at, crucifixions and so on. And which one would want to say should not be looked at. I don't mean painted crucifixions, but the Roman games were a spectacle in which people took strong visual interest. And we nowadays would say that they should not even have occurred, and that the interest was wrong because it was an interest. You should turn away, as St. Paul would say. But at the same time, we know that the aesthetic frame of mind, the frame of mind with which we try to appreciate what a thing is for us in our experience and as it presents itself to us, that frame of mind is indispensable to us. And when we take up that frame of mind, all our other values are active in both propelling our interest and withholding it. And all that Nietzsche is saying is that Nietzsche, lives in a world where the things that are objects of aesthetic interest are rather different. And he wants to emphasize those things which he thought the Greeks emphasized, the cruel aspect of things, the terrifying aspects of things, essentially the sacred sacrifice, which would have, which he would, was always in the back of his mind as the root of the aesthetic way of life. Hang on, there's somebody else. We can't go on forever. I think it's getting like the last movement of Haydn's Farewell Symphony anyway.
Yeah.
So just one more question.
Okay. So how many of the problems that are caused by non-genius architects are due to a lack of skill? And how many of these problems are due to being sort of forced to channel a grammar of power, economic, scientific? And how would you sort of empower architects to take more control over their work?
Gosh, I don't know. I would round them up, though, and terrorize them, and by forcing them to sit through this lecture. And they wouldn't be the same again. So that's thank you. Oh, great. Thank you.